At a corner cafe, Elena Sterling set her leather clutch on the counter. The ambient noise of the city hummed outside the cold glass windows. Her phone screen lit up with an urgent message. Distracted by the sudden corporate emergency, she grabbed her coffee and walked out, leaving the clutch behind. 3 tables away, Arthur Vance sat alone. His flannel sleeves were rolled up, revealing mechanic-scarred hands. He watched the forgotten leather clutch sit on the counter. He picked it up. Inside, neat stacks of high-denomination bills lay hidden. $40,000 in untraceable corporate funds. He simply zipped it back up. He caught her at the curb just as she opened her car door. He held the heavy clutch out, handing it over without a single word. Stunned, Elena opened the clutch, pulled out a crisp $500 bill, and extended it toward him. A simple transaction for a returned item. He did not take it. He merely looked at the money, then at her, his expression unreadable, before turning away to walk back inside. She stood frozen by her car door, the unaccepted bill fluttering slightly in the cold wind, watching the stranger disappear into the cafe. By 11 that morning, Elena was back at the Sterling Tower. She counted the money behind locked doors. Not a single bill was missing. She pulled up the cafe's security feed. She watched the man return her money, walk back to his table, and quietly finish his black coffee. Elena called Eleanor Pace into her office, pointing at the blurred license plate of the gray pickup truck captured on the building's exterior camera. Eleanor, the senior accountant who had served the family for decades, stared at the plate number, hesitated for a split second, then handed over the address. Elena drove toward the southern edge of the city, where the towering glass buildings thinned out into chain-link fences and birch trees. She parked her luxury sedan across the road from a modest wooden house. The mysterious man from the cafe was visible in the yard. Arthur was kneeling by the neighbor's fence, replacing a rotted wooden post, his steady hands moving with absolute precision and economy. On the porch sat a small girl, around 9 years old, a hardcover book open across her knees and a worn stuffed toy beside her. Arthur looked up from his work, his sharp jawline tightening as he recognized the luxury car. His expression instantly closed up. Elena stepped out of her car, holding a plain white unlabeled envelope containing $500, and crossed the quiet road slowly. She held out the envelope at the edge of the property line, stating it wasn't a corporate reward, but simply a personal thank you. Arthur stopped pounding the gravel, set his tools down against the post, stood up, and wiped his hands on his worn denim jeans. The following evening, unable to let the mystery rest, Elena drove through the South End until she spotted the familiar pickup truck outside a community clinic. She approached quietly in the cold air, stepping close to a side window where the blinds were drawn only 3/4 of the way down. Through the narrow gap, she saw Arthur. He wasn't fixing a fence, he was suturing a severe laceration on a young boy. His hands moved with terrifying precision. The needle passed in and out at identical depths, a flawless rhythm that belonged in an elite trauma ward. Elena turned away before she could be seen. Hours later, she sat in her silent penthouse, the glow of a laptop illuminating her face. Her search queries yielded a buried military archive. A photograph showed a younger Arthur in navy dress blues, awarded for combat surgical service. The man who had refused her money was a highly decorated trauma surgeon who had deliberately chosen to become completely invisible to the world. The next morning, the Sterling corporate board convened. Her uncle, Marcus Sterling, sat beside her, exuding the smooth authority of long-held power. Marcus smoothly pushed forward an off-cycle vendor requisition, requesting an untraceable cash withdrawal of exactly $40,000 for a vague project. Elena watched her uncle's composed smile, then glanced at the requisition slip, realizing the returned money was part of a dark internal web. Later that afternoon, Elena summoned Eleanor into her office, quietly requesting 18 months of historical invoices tied to the off-cycle vendor. The older woman placed the files on the desk, her hands trembling slightly. She leaned in, whispering a desperate warning for Elena to stop digging. Elena watched the senior accountant leave, her icy blue eyes turning back to the files. The web of fake shell companies was painfully clear. Seeking the only person outside her corrupted circle, Elena drove back to the South End. She left her formal corporate jacket in the car, wearing only a plain wool sweater. Arthur was on the porch in the fading evening light, his strong hands effortlessly fixing a flat tire on a small pink bicycle. She walked up the gravel path. This time, she did not hold an envelope. She held herself differently, less like a CEO, more like a person seeking an anchor. She offered him a position consulting for a rural trauma initiative. A job that required real field medicine, not a hospital tower. Arthur smoothed the tire patch with his thumb, his voice low and unyielding. He stated simply that he did not practice medicine anymore. Elena stepped closer, her voice dropping to a gentle whisper as she admitted she had seen him working at the clinic the night before. Before he could react, the screen door opened. Lily stepped out in her socks, looked at the beautiful stranger, and asked her father if the lady could stay for dinner. Arthur did not answer immediately. He pumped the tire, tested the pressure with his palm, and then simply nodded once. The kitchen smelled of garlic and butter, illuminated by the warm amber glow of a light fixture that hadn't been updated since the 80s. They shared a simple meal of spaghetti and green salad. Lily talked animatedly, twirling pasta, while Elena listened with genuine warmth. Lily spoke of her mother, who used to draw maps of imaginary countries and knew the names of all the winter stars. When Elena asked gently what happened, Lily answered with the heavy innocence of a child who had lived inside a sad fact for too long. She got sick, almost 3 years ago. Arthur set his fork down quietly. His knuckles turned white around the handle, and a gold wedding ring was still clearly visible on his left hand. After dinner, Lily surprised Elena at the door with a sudden, complete hug before running upstairs to brush her teeth. Arthur walked Elena back to her luxury car in the cold night air. He looked at her quietly and mentioned that his daughter didn't usually do that. He closed the car door for her. Elena did not start the engine right away. She just sat with her hands resting on the leather steering wheel. She gazed back at the warm, glowing square of the kitchen window, watching it until the light finally went out, leaving her in the dark. The next evening, Elena returned to the South End. Arthur was on the porch, a lone mug of coffee in his hand, as if he had been expecting her. She didn't wait to be invited. She sat across from him and set the question between them like a physical object: what does a $40,000 cash withdrawal mean? Arthur stared into the dark yard. Bribery, witness money, or laundering, he answered flatly. Look at who signed the requisition. The following morning, Marcus Sterling summoned Elena to his grand corner office. The Persian carpet alone was older than she was. Marcus leaned back, his voice dripping with paternal concern. He urged her to take a few weeks off, to escape the spreadsheets and rest in Aspen. His eyes, however, remained completely cold. Elena set her untouched coffee cup down, politely refusing his thinly veiled attempt to sideline her. That same afternoon, Arthur was working at the municipal annex building, replacing brushes on a heavy backup generator. The smell of ozone filled the small maintenance room. Through an open ceiling vent, he heard a familiar, lazy voice drifting from the adjacent office. It was Marcus Sterling on a private phone call. Marcus was discussing Elena. He casually suggested placing her under a wellness check, corporate code for having someone quietly and permanently removed from the board. Arthur's screwdriver stopped turning against the brass plate. He stood perfectly still in the dim room, his dormant military instincts snapping instantly back to life. Arthur packed his tools in silence. He left the municipal building through the back stairwell, moving with the calculated speed of a shadow. He did not use his cell phone. He stopped at an outdated public payphone on the edge of town, dropping coins into the slot. In her isolated penthouse, Elena's phone lit up with an unknown number. She answered, the silent dread already building in her chest. Arthur's voice was flat and commanding. He told her she was being watched, instructing her to avoid her own home that night. The next afternoon, Elena met Eleanor at an old, obscure diner far outside the city center, a place where corporate executives never went. Eleanor sat rigidly in a green vinyl booth. Her hands shook as she slid a small, heavy brass key across the scratched table. The older woman spoke in hushed, frightened tones. The key opened a safe deposit box holding ledgers that proved Marcus was paying off witnesses. Eleanor confessed her own son had been run off the road for finding the discrepancies. Elena closed her hand over the cold brass key. Knowing she needed someone outside the corporate web, Elena drove south under the cover of night, the city lights fading behind her. Arthur was already waiting on his dark porch when she arrived. Without a word, she walked up the steps and set the key between them. Arthur stared down at the small brass key on the wooden table, his analytical mind weighing the immense risks of stepping back into the light. He looked up at Elena, stating flatly that if he took this key, he would no longer be invisible, and neither would his daughter. Yet, seeing the silent desperation in her icy blue eyes, he picked up the key and told her they would leave at 4 the next morning. Long before dawn, Arthur's gray pickup truck cut through the thick, cold morning fog, leaving the quiet outskirts behind. Elena sat in the dim passenger seat, watching the dark, empty highway blur past, her hands tightly gripping her coat fabric. They arrived in Montpelier just as the clock struck 8. The town was draped in a heavy, ominous overcast morning shadow. Arthur walked into the Montpelier Savings Bank alone, his posture steady, exuding an unhurried confidence as he approached the vault corridor. The brass key fit the secure deposit box perfectly. Inside the metallic compartment lay a small, encrypted storage drive. The drive was taped to a single sheet of paper containing a brief note in Eleanor's shaky handwriting, a hidden passcode hint. Arthur tucked the encrypted drive securely into his canvas jacket and returned to the truck, immediately shifting into gear to take a secluded back route. On the secluded forest road, Elena stared at the small encrypted drive in her hands. The silence in the truck was heavy. Arthur's eyes shifted to the rearview mirror. A black SUV had emerged from the fog, closing the distance rapidly. Ahead of them, a second black SUV pulled across both lanes, completely blocking their path. Arthur did not swerve or panic. He applied the brakes smoothly, guiding the gray truck onto the gravel shoulder. He turned to Elena, his voice absolute. He told her to lock the doors and drive away if he did not return. Arthur stepped out into the cold mist. 3 men emerged from the SUVs, carrying heavy metallic devices low by their thighs. He walked toward the first man, keeping his hands open and visible at his sides, projecting no aggression. In a fraction of a second, the open hands moved. He effortlessly disarmed the first man, neutralizing the threat with absolute precision. The second man lunged. Arthur stepped inside the motion, redirecting his weight until the man lay immobilized on the gravel. The entire sequence took 22 seconds. Arthur walked calmly back to the truck, his breathing barely elevated. Arthur stepped back into the truck, closing the heavy door with a dull thud. Elena watched him, completely stunned by his clinical speed. They drove for 10 minutes in absolute silence, the truck's engine humming steadily as the misty pine trees blurred past the glass. He pulled over at a deserted gas station outside Stowe, stepping out toward an old, weathered outdoor payphone near the rust-stained pumps. Dropping coins into the slot, he spoke low into the receiver, requesting secure extraction logistics and a federal handoff in Boston within 24 hours. Hanging up, he guided the gray pickup truck down a narrow, unmarked private dirt road that disappeared into the dense forest. They arrived at a secluded timber cabin. Arthur walked up the porch steps, effortlessly locating a hidden key beneath an old, dirt-filled clay flower pot. Inside, a low yellow lamp illuminated the rustic wooden kitchen as soft, quiet winter snow began to fall outside the windowpane. Arthur set 2 mugs of hot, steaming tea on the wooden dining table, sitting down opposite Elena as the warmth filled the silent room. He finally spoke of his past, his years at Walter Reed, his multiple deployments, and the painful loss of his wife, Margaret, to illness. He explained why he could never perform surgery again. Elena reached across the table, her soft hand gently covering his rough, scarred knuckles. By 10 the next morning, they were in Boston. The federal prosecutor's office sat high on the 23rd floor, overlooking the icy harbor. Prosecutor Marissa Kane, a sharp, formidable woman Arthur had known from his military days, listened quietly as she inspected the drive. Marissa asked exactly 5 questions, made a single phone call, and within minutes, 2 federal agents began decrypting the files. In an adjacent room, Elena sat tall and composed, confidently giving her sworn statement regarding Marcus Sterling's massive financial crimes. While Elena spoke, Arthur's cell phone buzzed on the table. The caller ID showed Margaret's mother, his mother-in-law, who was watching Lily. He picked up the call. For the first time since Elena had met him, the absolute calm in Arthur's eyes shattered for one brief, terrifying second. Through the phone, a frantic voice explained that local officers were at her door with a sudden, fabricated emergency child welfare order. Arthur's tactical composure instantly resealed itself. He coldly ordered her to lock all doors and deny entry until he arrived. Hanging up, Arthur stepped back into the conference room, his presence heavy, announcing that Marcus was targeting his daughter. Marissa stood up, telling Arthur to go. Elena immediately grabbed her trench coat, looking at Arthur with an absolute refusal to stay behind. They rushed out of the high-rise and into the underground garage. Arthur's jaw was locked, his movements swift and rigid. The gray pickup truck devoured the miles heading north. Daylight quickly faded into a cold, heavy dusk. Despite the terror gripping him, Arthur drove with terrifying precision. He maintained exact speed limits, refusing to give any patrol car a reason to stop him. Elena sat in silence. She watched his profile, feeling the massive weight of the fear he was flawlessly suppressing for his daughter. It was nearly 2 in the morning when they finally arrived at the local police precinct, its harsh sodium lights buzzing in the dark. Arthur strode through the double doors of the lobby, completely ignoring the desk sergeant. Elena followed a step behind. A plainclothes detective stepped into his path, raising a hand. He smugly mentioned protective custody and mandatory legal procedures. Arthur didn't break stride. He pulled out a black leather trifold, flipping it open to reveal reactivated, high-level military credentials. He stated his rank and purpose with freezing authority. The detective stared at the federal badge, the arrogant color draining from his face. The man quickly stepped aside. Without another word, Arthur walked down the stark hallway toward the holding rooms. Arthur opened the door to a small, carpeted interview room at the end of the hall. A social worker sat in the corner. Lily was on a beige sofa, her arms wrapped tightly around her own knees. She was trying bravely not to cry. When she saw him, she didn't run immediately. She stood up slowly, processing the relief, before walking into his arms. Arthur dropped to his knees. He pulled his daughter against his chest, burying his face in her small shoulder. He held her in absolute silence. The social worker quietly looked at the floor and stepped out of the room. 10 minutes later, they walked out into the cold, empty parking lot. For the first time, Arthur's rigid shoulders shook, just once. Elena stood a few steps away, respectfully giving them space. Lily lifted her head and looked at the blonde woman. Without a word, the little girl reached her hand out across the cold distance separating them. Elena walked forward and took her hand. The three of them stood together under the yellow streetlights, bound by a silent, unbreakable trust. 2 days later, the truth finally caught up. Marcus Sterling was surrounded by federal agents at the international airport, his wrists locked in steel cuffs. The morning after the arrest, an emergency board meeting convened at the Sterling Tower. The vote to remove Marcus was unanimous. Elena stood at the head of the grand walnut table, reclaiming her family's legacy not as a heritage to preserve, but as an instrument to heal. Later that week, Eleanor waited anxiously on the chilly platform of the central train station. Her son finally stepped out of protective custody. He looked exhausted, wearing a winter coat that hung loosely over his shoulders. Eleanor rushed forward, wrapping her arms around her son in a desperate, tearful embrace that had been delayed for 14 months. Elena watched from a respectful distance. When Eleanor noticed her, the older woman crossed the platform and embraced Elena as well, their first hug in 22 years. Elena spent her entire weekend at her penthouse kitchen island, boldly rewriting the Foundation's mission statement to focus on rural healthcare. She brought the completed proposal to Arthur's kitchen, offering him a part-time consulting position. It was local, and entirely on his own terms. Arthur didn't answer immediately. He sat with his hands wrapped around a coffee mug, watching Lily arrange 3 hardcover books into a perfect tower on the rug. He looked back at Elena, his hardened eyes softening slightly, and gave a single, definitive nod. 6 months later, the long winter finally broke. The city had thawed, and the cherry trees along the park were brilliantly in bloom. It was a quiet Saturday afternoon in the South End. The neighbor's wooden fence, which Arthur had started repairing so long ago, was completely finished. Inside the house, Lily lay comfortably on the rug, deeply focused on a hardcover book, reading with the exact same quiet intensity her mother once had. Outside, Arthur and Elena sat in 2 wooden chairs facing the small yard. A stapled, 22-page grant proposal rested on the table between them. The proposal detailed the deployment of 3 mobile trauma units across the state's most rural counties. Arthur had mapped out every route and staffing model himself. Elena read the final page out loud. She lowered the paper and gently suggested that they name the first mobile unit after Margaret. Arthur did not answer for a long while. He looked out past the yard, toward the thin pale line of the lake over the rooftops. The gold wedding ring remained firmly on his left hand. Elena knew he might never take it off, and she had stopped waiting for him to. His voice did not break, it only slowed. He quietly told Elena that Margaret would have really liked that. His right hand rested casually on the wooden armrest between them. Elena's hand was resting gently over his, and he did not pull away. The wooden screen door creaked open behind them. Lily stepped out onto the porch in her socks, hugging the hardcover book to her chest. The young girl paused, her curious eyes shifting between Arthur and Elena sitting peacefully together in the afternoon sun. Without asking, she walked directly between their chairs and sat down comfortably on the wooden porch step at their feet. Lily leaned back, resting her head gently against Elena's knee as she stared out toward the sunny yard. Elena looked down with a soft smile, slowly reaching out to rest her hand on the little girl's brown hair. Lily opened her book. The page revealed a delicate ink drawing of a paper boat, bordered by her late mother's elegant handwriting. She began to read aloud. Her voice was soft and rhythmic, though the gentle wind off the lake carried some of the words away. Elena did not catch every word, and she did not need to. Arthur listened quietly, his rough fingers turning under Elena's palm to gently close around her hand. The golden light reflecting off the distant lake shifted slowly across the weathered side of the house as the afternoon deepened. He had not returned the money for a reward, and she had not followed him for a story. Neither of them had been looking, and that was exactly why they could trust what they had found. By October, the Vermont landscape had transformed into a blazing canopy of deep reds and burnt oranges. Parked outside the Sterling Tower were 3 massive, custom-built medical vehicles, the realization of Elena's new Foundation mission. Elena stood confidently at a podium in the crisp autumn air, officially launching the initiative to a crowd of local officials and press. Standing by the lead vehicle was Arthur. He had traded his faded flannel for a dark tactical medical uniform, looking every bit the elite surgeon he once was. Painted sharply on the side of the heavy truck was the initiative's title, honoring the memory of his late wife, Margaret. As the press conference concluded, the crowd broke into applause. Elena stepped down from the podium with a satisfied smile. She walked over to Arthur. They shared a quiet, deeply proud look, acknowledging the immense journey that had brought them here. The serene moment was shattered when the radio on Arthur's tactical vest crackled to life with a severe emergency dispatch. A logging accident on a remote mountain pass. Arthur's posture shifted instantly into absolute military focus as he signaled his medical team. He climbed into the heavy cab. The massive engine roared, emergency lights flashing brilliantly as the unit rolled out to save its first life. The heavy mobile trauma unit tore through the winding mountain roads, ascending quickly into the cold, high-altitude mist. Back at the Sterling Tower, Elena stood in the new Foundation Command Center, tracking their GPS beacon on a glowing digital map. Inside the truck's cabin, Arthur's focus was absolute. He coordinated with local dispatch, his voice steady over the roaring engine. They arrived at a devastating scene. A massive logging truck had rolled off the pass, scattering heavy timber across the gorge. Local first responders were overwhelmed by the sheer scale of the wreckage. Arthur stepped out of the heavy vehicle, instantly taking command. He moved toward the crushed cabin with the calm, terrifying efficiency of a man who had seen worse in war zones. Inside the twisted metal, the truck driver was trapped and fading fast. A standard ambulance ride down the mountain would be too late. Arthur assessed the critical situation in a matter of seconds. The man needed immediate, highly invasive stabilization. He turned back to his team and gave the final, decisive order. They were not transporting the patient, they were operating here. The heavy rear doors of the trauma unit swung open, revealing a brilliantly lit, fully equipped mobile surgical suite ready for action. Under the sterile, piercing white LED lights, Arthur began the procedure. Every motion was stripped of all waste and hesitation. His team moved with silent, synchronized rhythm, assisting him as he navigated the trauma deep within the driver's chest. The monitors hissed and pulsed, providing a steady rhythmic beat that filled the small cabin, keeping the patient anchored to life. Back in the command center, Elena remained frozen, her gaze locked on the vital signs monitor as the waves fluctuated in the darkness. Hours passed, the only sound inside the MTU being Arthur's calm, barked instructions and the persistent hum of the mobile air filtration system. As the final suture was knotted, Arthur exhaled a long, heavy breath, his eyes meeting his team's in a moment of shared, silent victory. Arthur stepped out of the heavy truck. The oppressive fog was finally beginning to thin, replaced by the soft, golden light of dawn. He peeled off his blue medical gloves, his hands slightly trembling from the adrenaline finally leaving his system after the intensity of the surgery. The rescued driver was stable and being prepared for a final, secure transport. The impossible had been achieved right there on the mountain pass. Arthur looked up at the clearing sky, his face weathered but calm, knowing that he had finally found his purpose back in the light. By mid-morning, the heavy mobile trauma unit rolled back into the city limits, its emergency lights finally powered down. The massive gray truck pulled into the Sterling Tower Plaza, the engine rumbling to a slow, exhausted halt. Arthur stepped down from the cab. His tactical uniform was slightly rumpled, his shoulders carrying the heavy, satisfying weight of a life saved. Elena was waiting near the glass doors of the tower, holding 2 steaming paper cups of coffee in the crisp autumn air. She walked forward and handed him a cup without demanding a debrief or a grand speech. Arthur took it with a tired nod, leaning his back against the massive tire of the medical truck. Elena stood beside him in comfortable silence, both of them looking up at the towering glass building that had finally been repurposed for good. Later that evening, Arthur returned to the quiet wooden house in the South End. He found Lily asleep on the living room sofa, her mother's hardcover book resting gently on her chest. Arthur carefully lifted his daughter into his arms, carrying her upstairs with the steady grace of a man fully at peace. Weeks turned into months as winter approached again. The highly anticipated federal trial of Marcus Sterling finally commenced. Inside the grand mahogany courtroom, Elena walked down the aisle, her posture projecting absolute, unshakable strength. She took the witness stand, raising her right hand to swear under oath, ready to dismantle her uncle's corrupt legacy. Across the room, Marcus sat in a standard prison uniform. His silver hair was unkempt, but his eyes still burned with cold, calculating malice. Despite his imprisonment, Marcus was not entirely powerless. During a brief recess, he whispered a sharp command to his defense attorney. The silent order was simple: activate the remaining loyalists hidden within the Sterling Foundation to destroy Elena's new initiatives. The next morning at the Foundation, a rogue executive named Wallace silently initiated a corporate motion to freeze all MTU funding. Elena sat at her desk, staring at her monitor in disbelief as the critical financial accounts were suddenly locked. The mobile trauma units, which had just begun saving lives across the rural counties, were abruptly grounded due to a lack of operational budget. At the clinic, Arthur received the digital notification on his tablet. His expression hardened, recognizing the familiar tactics of a desperate enemy. Refusing to let the initiative die, Arthur drove straight to the Sterling Tower, carrying a thick dossier of digital counterintelligence. Elena met him outside the boardroom. They did not speak, a single, determined nod was enough to align their strategy. Together, they pushed open the heavy mahogany doors, interrupting Wallace and his rogue faction who were already celebrating their sabotage. Elena walked to the head of the table and dropped the heavy file onto the polished wood with a resounding thud. Wallace attempted to maintain his arrogant facade, demanding that the unauthorized consultant leave the executive room. Arthur simply stepped forward. With cold, analytical precision, he recited the exact offshore routing numbers Wallace had used to hide his tracks. The color drained from the executive's face as he realized Arthur possessed military-grade tracing skills that had completely exposed the conspiracy. Elena delivered a final, unbreakable ultimatum: release the frozen medical funds and resign immediately, or face the federal agents waiting in the lobby. Trembling, Wallace opened his laptop and typed in the authorization codes, dismantling Marcus's final trap. Down in the snowy plaza, the heavy chains fell from the gates, and the massive diesel engines of the trauma units roared back to life. By December, the Mobile Trauma Initiative had saved dozens of lives across the snow-covered rural counties of Vermont. Inside the Sterling Tower, the atmosphere was completely transformed. The corporate legacy was finally one of undeniable healing. Elena stood by her expansive office window, watching the gentle snowfall over the city, a peaceful smile resting on her face. Far away from the corporate towers, Arthur's quiet house in the South End was warmly decorated for the winter holidays. The smell of cinnamon and pine filled the small kitchen as Arthur expertly carved a roasted holiday dinner. Lily sat at the vintage wooden table, happily drawing a new, detailed map of an imaginary world in her sketchbook. The front door opened, letting in a gust of cold wind. Elena stepped inside, brushing snow from her heavy wool coat. Lily immediately dropped her pencils and ran to greet her, wrapping her arms around Elena in a tight, familiar hug. Arthur watched from the kitchen counter. His sharp, weathered features softened into a look of absolute, unconditional peace. They sat down at the table together. They had started as strangers divided by secrets and wealth, but they had finished as a family.